Hello, MBA hopefuls. Great to have you today live with MBA Waves, where we'll be discussing all things business and education. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel because that helps us to continue to give you great free content and meet the schools and the individuals in the admissions landscape so that you can get the best candidacy possible and be the most informed person. So today, super excited. We've got colleague and friend Brett Ethridge of Dominate Test Prep, and we're going to be focusing on GRE, GMAT, and EA. Which tests should you take? Today, we're going to look at round 2 and the pressures to figure out which test you should take, how to decide between which of those tests and how to prepare for them, and really how to get the best score possible. So I really want to welcome Krithika, my co-host here. Welcome. And also want to welcome Brett. It's great to see you.
It's good to see you as well.
Yeah, it's nice.
It's been a while.
It's been a really long time. So I'm excited to do this episode with you. I'm your host today, Bara Sapir, and welcome everyone who's joining us. And just let's dive right in. So who should consider taking the GRE, GMAT, and EA, and why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's just a simple answer, right? Everybody should take this test or that test. We're going to give you the answer. No, we're going to help you inform that decision and go through some of the strengths and weaknesses of each exam, the content tested, the format, and so forth. We'll get into all of those weeds here in a moment. I would actually just suggest that the best first question to ask is actually, where do you want to apply and why? Why do you want to go back to business school? Get crystal clear on your why, and get a firm list of schools that you're planning to apply to. So often I'll get an email or a phone call from a prospective student saying, hey, can you help me get a 700 on the GMAT? And sort of old numbers. We'll talk about the new version of the GMAT and how the scores relate and compare, and things have changed with the GMAT. So we'll get into all of that. And I'll say, yeah, I'm sure we can help you get a 700 plus on the GMAT, but like, where are you applying? And they're like, oh, I haven't figured it out yet. I just know I want to take the GMAT. It's like, well, why do you want to take the GMAT? You know what? So those are some of the questions that you need to get crystal clear on first. And that may inform which test to take. Now, most schools these days accept the GMAT and the GRE for the full-time MBA programs. I'll give you a little bit more of a history lesson here in a moment. The executive assessment is sort of like the outlier exam in some ways of the three that we're talking about, because it's more geared toward executive MBA programs, online MBA programs, evening programs, and some full-time MBA programs as well. So some schools, I'm thinking about Virginia, Darden Business School, Georgetown, some schools do accept the executive assessment as part of the application for their full-time traditional 2-year MBA programs alongside the GMAT and GRE. So for some schools you might be applying to, you may actually be able to choose among these three that we're talking about. But if you're applying for an executive MBA program, for example, you may literally only have the choice of the executive assessment. Or if you're applying to Harvard or some sort of traditional 2-year MBA program that only accept the GMAT and GRE, you don't even have to consider the executive assessment. So that's sort of a big picture overview of the three exams and which types of schools might accept each of them. But it has to start with your list of schools that you're applying to. Go to their website, get the application requirements, what's expected, and then you might have a choice to make. And if you do, now you can filter what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the show in terms of deciding which exam is best for you specifically.
I often think about the tests as being the gatekeepers as the schools that you can apply to, right? So like, it's good to have that dance between what schools are you looking at, what test, and then what do you need? Like there's this shimmying that's going between both of them. And even for some of you, let's say you were thinking about going to medical school and you took the MCATs, there are some schools that will accept the MCATs and the LSAT. So reaching out to the different schools to figure it out, we're not going to talk about those schools or that aspect of it, but you have choices, which is really nice.
It is. And I would just add, for those of you who may not know, these exams do have a shelf life. And so there is a school of thought, and I get inquiries about this all the time, and students who reach out and say, hey, I know I want to go to business school. I have the time, I have the bandwidth to prepare for the GMAT or the GRE. I want to get that score, have it in my back pocket. The score is good for 5 years. So it's not like you absolutely, I have to apply round 2 this year. Otherwise, it's not worth taking these exams. I mean, certainly if you have the time, the bandwidth, you're going to take it at some, or you want to go back to business school at some point in the future, maybe round 3, maybe next season, next year, that's fine. Study now, get your GMAT score, your GRE score, your EA score, and you can sort of file that away. So if that's you, you don't absolutely have to know exactly where you're going to be applying. But I still think for most students, because the GMAT and the GRE executive assessment, they're only one part of the application anyway. A huge part of it is being able to write an essay where you answer the all-important question, why business school? Why Harvard? And so kind of start there is usually where I steer my students.
I love where you're going with it, because you first started with the destination and
That's right.
saying that these are just the tickets, and decide the ticket after you decide the destination. And this is where I like when we're discussing it, because it's round 2. There are a lot of people on the fence of, I don't have a great score. Should I go for round 2 this year? Should I go for round 1 this year? So for all those listeners out there, this is where I think we're going to get into the weeds. And can you tell a little bit more about how is the format and content different for all these tests?
Good question. So I suggested that the EA is sort of the outlier compared to the GMAT and the GRE in the sense of the types of schools and programs it's used to apply to. Again, quick history lesson. If you go back even 10 years, the GMAT was the business school exam. If you were applying to business school, you took the GMAT, period, end of story. Then the GRE sort of crept in and it's taken market share. We'll talk about that. Right now, it's close to a 50-50 split at a lot of schools in terms of who accepts the GMAT and GRE, who applies with the GMAT and the GRE. So anyway, back to our history lesson. Business school, you're taking the GMAT. Any other graduate program, pretty much at all, you're taking the GRE, other than like med school and stuff like that. And then, starting about 10 years ago, the executive assessment came on the landscape for executive MBA programs. And so there was this very clear delineation. So the executive assessment will more for the executive MBA types of programs, GMAT and GRE for traditional. In terms of where you're applying, in terms of the content and format of the exams themselves, the executive assessment and GMAT are actually most similar. In fact, until the latest iteration of the GMAT, they were nearly identical, save for the length of the exam. In terms of the question types, the content tested, almost the exact same. And so if you're making your decision, you're like, maybe I want to go for an executive MBA, maybe I want to go for a 2-year, like I'm going to take either the GMAT or GRE, don't even consider, GMAT or executive assessment, don't even consider the GRE because it's just that much different. So let me explain what I mean by that. There's a couple ways to think about that. Let's think about content itself first. The problem-solving content, the math on the 3 exams are basic algebra, basic arithmetic, common word problems, some statistics, a little bit of data analysis, probability, combinatorics, and things like that. So that's similar across all of the exams. Currently, the GRE is sort of an outlier in that it's the one exam that also includes geometry. So if you're taking notes at home on your little scratch paper, your little cheat sheet, okay, what's the major differentiator on the math side? The GRE, I'm going to have to learn this geometry stuff. Okay, but the GMAT and the executive assessment have this weird question type called data sufficiency. It's a really weird way of thinking about math where you're just determining sufficiency of content. Okay, so that's sort of weird and unique to the GMAT and the executive assessment. Okay, but the GRE has this weird math question type called quantitative comparisons. So you'll have to learn that if you opt for the GRE. Okay, so that's sort of the quant side of things. On the verbal side, again, 30,000-foot view, I view and talk to my students more about the GRE as being vocabulary intensive. So on the verbal side, there's reading comprehension across all 3 exams. But on the GRE, you have a lot of questions that really test your vocabulary, your English vocabulary in context. The executive assessment, the GMAT, are more logical reasoning based. There are these critical reasoning questions where you're analyzing arguments, strengthening and weakening arguments. Yeah, you have the reading comprehension. So if you're more logical, if you like that critical thinking, logical reasoning, GMAT and executive assessment. And then, oh, by the way, the executive assessment also has a lot of grammar because it maintained and still has a question type called sentence correction, no longer on the GMAT as of earlier this year, where you have to basically analyze sentences and decide whether or not they're grammatically correct. So that's still part of the executive assessment. Okay, if we're still taking notes at home, the GRE, you still have to write an essay. The GMAT and executive assessment, no essay. And then the GMAT and executive assessment also have they're called two different things on each exam, but it's basically analyzing charts and graphs and analyzing data and answering questions about that data. So I hope that's enough of an explanation, big picture. There's some differences in terms of scoring algorithm and ability to skip questions and whether or not they're question or section adaptive. We can go ahead and get into that if you want, but hopefully that was helpful in terms of sort of the content that differentiates the three exams.
It's super helpful. It's a lot of information. And what I know that on my blog, probably you have it on yours as well, and they're out there. You can actually see comparison.
Yeah.
So if you're not taking notes, we can put up later a place where you can, if you've got that on yours, we can put that out for those of you who are listening. A fun fact, I have a GMAT sentence correction book that is now obsolete.
Yeah.
Fun fact, I'm changing that into the executive assessment sentence correction, and I've got approved by my publisher. So that's will be coming out. That will be coming out soon. So all that work won't be for naught. I thought it might be fun to kind of parse out the data, like let's talk about data sufficiency for a minute, right? So I actually think that this is a really fun part of the exam. It's the part where you could be like, you're a spy or a detective. It's not the part of you who is just a math cruncher, a number cruncher. Yes. So for those of you listening, like this is interestingly, like this part almost reminds me a little bit of the game section, which has been removed from the LSAT, but it's, do you have enough information to answer the question? And I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. The way I think about it, Brett, is it gives you the opportunity to show that you can think outside of the box, that you're not a big, like reckless risk taker, that you don't actually have to come up with an answer. You just have to see if you have sufficient data, right? And it moves sections, right? It was in the math section, and then it moved over. It's no longer
on the executive assessment. It's still paired with problem solving. That's
right. Which is super interesting. I think that they've really wanted to differentiate the tests, and there is slight different flavors, but they're still like in the chocolate family. Like one is mint chocolate chip and one is chocolate chip.
Yeah. Well, and let me sort of, again, I like the 30,000 foot view as people are trying to make this decision. The reason I think we're talking about data sufficiency here is, remember, sort of big picture, each of the exams has a unique math question type. I talked about on the GRE side, it's called quantitative comparisons. On that exam, you're comparing information in two columns, basically, two quantities, and determining which one's bigger. Column A is bigger, column B is bigger, they have the same value, whatever. On the GMAT and executive assessment, it's this data sufficiency, which we're going to keep talking about here. And a big decision point is, do I like quantitative comparisons or data sufficiency better? Because if a lot of the math is the same, if you have to answer word problems and a lot of the problem solving is the same, that becomes a major differentiator on the quantitative reasoning side of things. Although, as Bara suggested, data sufficiency is now not even part of the quant section on the GMAT. And for the longest time, I would steer people, actually, and we're not trying to steer you one way or the other, but, well, I wouldn't steer anybody anywhere, but my students tended to think that quantitative comparisons on the GRE is actually easier than data sufficiency on the GMAT and executive assessment. Before I go further, has that been your experience, Bara? Like, do your students find quantitative comparisons or data sufficiency easier?
You know, it's funny because that doesn't wind up being the deciding factor as much as some of the verbal.
Good point. Okay.
You know?
Yeah. Are Okay, good. Yeah.
I find that, and when it comes down to it, the quant comparison for the US based clients remember it from SATs a
Okay,
little
yeah.
bit, right? So it's a different beast. And it also depends on if the student is really allied with this myth that you need the GMAT for business school, right?
Sure.
Sometimes I find I need to remind them that you actually can take, and really, you could take either one. Which do you feel better at? Which are you scoring better? So I don't I don't get into that much of a struggle. I think that, like, stepping back, I do think that data sufficiency is a little bit more, um, it's a little more slippery
Yeah.
than quantitative comparison, and
But
it's how
once you
comfortable someone.
figure it out,
Yeah,
and it clicks, once you
yeah,
get it to click, and this is my encouragement, it might take a while, but you will get there. And when it clicks, you'll wish there were more of them.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
fun.
They're fun. That's it. So let's keep talking about it, because I think the way you described it is good. You're determining sufficiency. The way I like to think about it and describe it to my students is a traditional math word problem I think about as like a pyramid. It starts with, an upside down pyramid, traditional word problems, the math you've done your whole life. It's an upside down pyramid. You have all of this stuff at the top, all of the data. Train A travels east at 45 miles per hour. Train B heads west 3 hours later at a rate of blah, 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 blah. And it's giving you all this information and funneling it down to your question. The question's at the bottom. At what time will they meet up? Okay. And then you have all the information you need. Can you use that information and answer the question? Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but that's the objective. Data sufficiency is the exact opposite. It's like a normal pyramid, and it starts with a question. What time will train A and train B meet? I don't know. You have to tell me something. Oh, okay. Statement one. Train A leaves heading east at 45 miles an hour. Not enough information. I need to know something about train B. And so they're like filling in the information that maybe you can use to answer that question in the statements. And you're simply determining, I still need more information. I still need more information. Or, oh yeah, I could use that. I can find out what time they're going to meet. And so it's just a really cool way of sort of thinking about it. It's an inverse way of thinking about math. You still have to know some stuff. But again, sort of once it clicks, it makes a lot of sense. And the one final thing I would say, and just sort of add to the mix, is when the GMAT underwent its revisions late last year, and then formally it's the only GMAT available now this year, the GMAT Focus Edition, it has introduced a non-math data sufficiency type of question, which is more logic-based as well. And so perhaps, Bara, that's one of the reasons why they also moved it out of the quant section, put it in data insights, because, yeah, most of the questions are still math-based. What time will train A and train B meet? And maybe you have enough information, maybe you don't. But sometimes it's like, more like the logic games. You brought up the LSAT. It's like, which I don't know, which toy did Elf C make, and it's more logical reasoning based in trying to answer that question. And so those can be fun as well.
I want to just piggyback on one thing that you said, which is that, and I sort of mentioned this before, which is when you are in the data sufficiency and you are not required to actually have an answer, you have to resist the dopamine hit to get an answer.
Good point.
So you have to, it's an interesting process to go through, because they're not asking for the answer. They're just asking whether you have enough information.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting psychological movement for some of the questions to move through.
Yeah.
And
But it's
I
also,
think it mimics the case study approach so well, especially in business school, and what they need, because you're not going to get all the data for the decisions in real life at the pace that we're all moving.
yeah. And again, that's also probably why they moved it to data insights. I think the new data insights section on the GMAT is so valuable in terms of testing the types of things you will be expected to do in business school and beyond in your career. And a lot of students, by the way, you're already doing some of this stuff in your job. Yeah, you brought up this idea of are students resistant to even taking these exams? Are they useful for business school and so forth? Granted, can you find the hypotenuse of a triangle, which used to be on the GMAT, no longer the GMAT because they did away with, geometry stuff. It's still on the GRE. But yeah, I could totally understand when my students are like, why in the world am I trying to find the radius of a circle? How is that relevant to business school? But pretty much all the stuff on the GMAT now is pretty applicable to business school. And I think what you're saying is exactly spot on about data sufficiency, preparing you for the way of thinking and trying to make decisions as a CEO potentially one day with limited information. How can you filter the information you do have, extrapolate it, perhaps make decisions about that information?
Yeah. And I was one of the few who felt very sorry when the SC went away.
Yes,
because it was fun.
Yeah. Well, yeah. If I were gonna hint at the exam that I prefer, like if I were going to business school again and could choose them all three, I'd probably take the EA because I just love sentence correction. I love it. I'm good at grammar. I'm a big reader, so it's just right in my wheelhouse. Yeah, I hated to see the GMAT get rid of it, although again, I understand why.
Yeah, and so there's a hint there, for those of you who are still like hungover with the classic GMAT, you can go to the EA if your school accepts it. All right, so I have like another, question that came up. GMAT Focus recently did like a shakeup of the percentiles, and it just dipped a little bit for some of it. But we all know that a 685 out of a 805 is now the 740 on an 800. So that's kind of like a big kind of a mindset shift for a lot of people, and even for business schools. Business schools are yet to publish what they saw in the GFE ranges, if at all it happened last year and so on. So can you tell a little bit more about what have you been hearing about the difficulty, or what's your take on the percentiles, and how are you reading this?
Yeah. My take is that it's much ado about nothing. It give it a year, and then it'll become the new norm for everybody taking the GMAT. I mean, everybody has the old numbers in their mind. I wouldn't even say everybody, right? If you're just now thinking about applying to business school and you're just seeing the GMAT for the first time, like it's all new to you anyway. So yeah, I'm going to set my sights on a 650 or higher, 655, because that'll put me in the 90th percentile and that'll make me competitive at most schools. Who cares that used to be a 700? And the business schools themselves are going to have to recalibrate, but that's the beauty of percentiles. I mean, the definition of percentile is that it equates things. It levels the playing field. Like if I'm the admissions officer or I'm a test prep instructor and I'm talking to a student and they're asking me what score should I shoot for, and I say, yeah, anything in the 90th percentile should make you competitive at the schools that you're applying to. And they say, okay, what's the 90th percentile score? I just point to what that score is. 655 on the GMAT, a 318 on the GRE, a 155 on the EA. I might be a little bit off on some of those numbers. We have stuff on our website. You can find it on Google in terms of the exact percentile rankings. Or a 5-minute and 38-second mile. Like if I want to be in the 90th percentile running the mile, what do I have to run? So it's just comparing you to everybody else. And objectively, what's the score? Irrelevant. Now, there is the institutional memory of I need a 700 on the GMAT. And some students still come to me with that old mindset. And I say a 700 puts you in the 98th percentile now. You're not getting, you're probably not getting a 700 or a 705 because now the score ranges end in a 5 instead of a 0. So if you get a 705, well done. Not as likely anymore. So, but I think we're just one application season away from it being completely irrelevant. Back to your point, though, I think it's more on the admissions officer side. Is they just have to have their side-by-side comparison. I was looking at kind of the TUX numbers, and they they still published this past year their average GMAT score. It's 727 or something like that. And they basically said they didn't even factor in GMAT focus scores because so few people applied with GMAT focus scores. Okay, so that makes sense. So they're still working off the old numbers. This next year, students applying now, you guys watching this, have no choice. You're taking the new exam. Your scores will be in the 600s for the more than likely. Some of you will score in the 700s, 98th, 99th percentile scores. That's great. But you can get into Harvard in the 600s now. You just will be able to because they have no choice but to accept the new scores that have been ratcheted lower. Most students, even the elite of the elite, the best of the best, applying to Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, will now have scores in the mid to upper 600s, and that's just a good score now. So it'll normalize. And that's just my view on it. Give it a cycle and it'll normalize and it's going to be a non-issue.
Do you find also with scores, Brett, that the workplace is no longer really looking at them the same way they used to look at GMATs? It's now, because it used to be like, I don't know, 5-10 years ago that we would tell students, you could take either test, but the consulting job might want to know what your GMAT score is.
That's right.
But that's no longer an issue, and they're not looking at GRE.
Exactly. And not even because of the new version of the GMAT. I mean, the last time, I think it's been several years, at least for my students, that anybody's been asked about their GMAT score when applying to consulting firms, investment banks, or anything like that. It's not to say there aren't some companies out there that might be interested. But if they are, just print out the side-by-side comparison and say, look, my score actually is good. Trust me.
Right. What do you think about GRE scores and comparing GRE and GMAT scores?
I still think it's enough. I mean, there are the what do they call it? Reconciliation tables. The concordance. Yeah, the concordance tables, right? So there are tables that exist that you can get off the ETS website saying, look, here's a comparable GRE score. I think the GRE and the GMAT are enough apples to oranges that trying to equate the scores, both because of the scoring algorithm, the types of questions tested, the adaptive nature of the sections versus question adaptive. There's so many differences that I think it's a little bit of a fool's errand to try to compare the scores, but the tables exist and admissions officers use them. And so, I don't know, just go look and compare. I think at this point, admissions officers are so fairly neutral as to whether or not you apply with a GRE or a GMAT that they know what sort of GRE scores they're looking for, what sort of GMAT scores they're looking for. And again, I think it goes back to the percentiles, just whatever the 90th percentile GRE score is, hey, that's what I'm shooting for. And the admissions officers know that that's a 90th percentile GRE score, and they're good with it. Whether or not it actually compares to GMAT, who cares? Because you applied with a GRE, they decided they accept the GRE, so the GRE score is really all that matters.
Yeah, and I don't think that if they're looking at two different folks that, like, they're not going to pick one person. Like, if the tests are equal, they're not going to say like, oh, but this person took this test, so we're going to, like, you don't have a leg up.
And it used to be that way, actually. I would say going back 4 or 5 years, maybe 5, kind of pre-COVID, where the GRE was still making inroads, but schools didn't have to or weren't publishing their GRE scores of their admitted students as part of the ranking specifically. I mean, let's call it what it is. They could allow you in with a less than standard GRE score because nobody would have to know about it. They like you as a candidate. They want you in their classrooms. You don't have a comparable GRE score to a 720 GMAT, but who cares? Because nobody's ever going to know. We don't have to publish it. Now all the top schools are publishing their average GRE scores, average GMAT scores. So you don't really have a leg up if you take one or the other. You just have, if you're going to apply with the GRE, it's got to be a good GRE score. If you're going to apply with the GMAT, it has to be a good GMAT score. But now we're in a world where the EA, the executive assessment, is sort of playing that role. So if you're applying to a school that accepts the EA, they're not publishing that anywhere. They're average EA scores. And so maybe you can skate by with a little bit lower EA score because it's not showing up anywhere. Nobody's ever going to know. You're in the same classroom with the 720 GMAT folks. So again, who cares?
But it's kind of scored differently.
It is.
The EA, and the way, my understanding of the EA is that a lot of schools just want you to reach a threshold, basically.
I was going to say that. That's exactly right. It's not as cutthroat because it's a check mark on the application. It's like If you hit the
Explain that.
150, and a 150, by the way, is like an average executive assessment score. So if you're applying to an executive MBA program and you hit the minimum 150, it's a check mark on the application. You're no different than the person who struggles for 3, 4, 5 months studying like crazy and gets the 156. Who cares? It's no better than your 150 in the eyes of the admissions officers for certain programs. Now, if the executive assessment, reading the tea leaves, if it continues to gain ground and becomes more of a norm, accepted at more traditional full-time MBA programs, and is being equated with the GRE and GMAT scores, now they might care a little bit more. The problem is we don't have to go down this road too much, but the range of scores on the EA is so narrow that it's really hard to even change your score by 1 point. And 1 point's a huge percentile change because there's such a narrow range, because of the original intent of the executive assessment wasn't to parse the 88th percentile from the 92nd percentile on the GMAT, where the range of scores is hundreds of points. It's like a range of like 15 points, around the mean on the executive assessment. So it's a lot harder to stand out on the executive assessment. Anyway.
So another way of looking at it, and this is kind of a crass way of saying it, and I can be crass, is that if people begin to exploit the flexibility of the EA, business schools are going to probably pressure ETS and their admissions folks to say there's too many people doing the EA and we need to have be more on top of the scores.
Yeah.
But right now, that I won't say it's a loophole, but it can be. Like, I've definitely seen students say, I'm going to do the EA because I don't have to be as on top of the score.
Yeah,
I can
exactly.
get that threshold.
And it's not as big a deal as you're suggesting, because only a handful of schools are still accepting it, or are accepting it for the full-time MBA program. But you're right. If that all of a sudden increases, it will have to be addressed, maybe, or maybe they'll just do something similar to the EA that they did with the GMAT, which is just recalibrate the whole scale, score scale, scoring algorithm, and all of that type of stuff to normalize things a little bit. I would say, and I don't know where we want to go with this conversation at this point, but I would say this, since we're sort of touching on this, loopholes and which can you maybe skate by with, and back to the original question of which should you take. Let me maybe come at it from a slightly different angle and suggest things you should not consider, reasons you should not have as your primary motivator for choosing these exams. And that is, you should absolutely not be looking for the easy way out. I do not think that you should make your decision by which one's easier, which one can I skate by with, which one has a loophole, maybe I should take the EA instead because they're not reporting the score, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For a lot of reasons. I'll add to that. I mean, if we go back to 2020, there was almost this race to the bottom between the GMAT and the GRE. They were trying to sort of one-up each other in making the exam shorter, fewer questions. Let's get rid of geometry, because they just want, I mean, if we're going to be crass, if we're going to be a little bit cynical, they wanted your money. During COVID, schools went test optional and people stopped taking these exams, and these are big corporations that need the dollars. And so the GMAT wanted you to take the GMAT, the GRE wanted you to take the GRE, and they're like, we're going to make our exam shorter. And so the GMAT worked to make its exam shorter. And like the next week, the GRE came out and said, we're going to make ours even shorter. You shouldn't take the GRE because it's 15 minutes shorter. Like, if you can't sit for 15 extra minutes or solve 3 extra questions, you don't have the right mindset applying to business school in the first place. Now, you might still choose to take the GRE and reap the benefit of a slightly shorter exam, save a few dollars. I think the GRE right now is a little bit cheaper. But look, you're about to go spend tens of thousands of dollars in business school, grad school, whatever. Don't try to save $50 on your entrance exam fee. So those are the reasons you shouldn't make the decision. And I would add this, in terms of a mindset, treat preparing for the GRE, the GMAT, the executive assessment as your first business school class. For some of you guys watching this, it's been a while since you've been in school, especially if you're going to be applying for an executive MBA program, taking the executive assessment. I have students in their 50s going back to business school. Awesome. Well done. But you haven't had to solve for X in like 30 years. And you're going to have to do some of this stuff in business school. And so don't take the easy way out. Don't take the exam that's going to be shorter and it's going to be the least study time and I'll save $50 applying. Instead, have the mindset of, you know what? I'm going to actually get used to studying again. I'm going to have a syllabus and some practice tests, and I'm going to learn how to solve for X again. And I'm going to remember probability rules. And I'm just going to treat this like a class. I'm going to spend a few dollars on a prep course. I'm going to take this things 2 or 3 times to get a good competitive score. I'm going to show that I'm serious about applying to business school. And oh, by the way, all of the reading comprehension and the math skills and analyzing data that I learn in the context of preparing for whichever exam I choose will put me in a much better position on day one in the business school classroom to succeed. And so I'll get off my soapbox now, but that would just be my encouragement as you're filtering the decision process.
I want to just say one more thing about this. I'm so like, you are describing growth mindset right now. Like you are totally, completely describing how to look at an obstacle and look at it as an opportunity. And honestly, it's really good for your brain,
Yes.
right? This is actually really good for your health as well, right? If you're learning something new, it's like one of the top things that you can do for brain health and for it's a good thing to do overall. But I know Eric often talks about, this is your first business school class also. I also want to just throw this out there that for many students, you might feel a little hesitant about one of the exams, but you want to make sure that it's not content or test strategy related. You might just have anxiety about taking exams.
Sure.
Right? Or you might just be a slow test taker. So you want to, I mean, it is plugging the things that I do, but you want to address why is it that you might not feel totally comfortable while taking the exam. Now, you might not be comfortable because of what Brett said, that you haven't looked at how to factor out X, in 20 years, but it also might be there's just this, that you're applying and there's a lot of younger people applying at the same time, and that's just triggering to you. So identifying what the issue is. This is a coachable test. Brett and I have businesses that are all about coaching, and we've been in business decades. I mean, between the two of us, it's got to be over 50 or 60 years.
I'm coming up on 20 years that I've been in the industry. So
I've been longer. So yeah. But, we have different formats, which also really speaks to figure out how you're going to best learn, right? How are you going to best take in the material? You might learn best by having a course or a class or a private tutor or DIY or just the book. So that's another step with this that, we can certainly talk about in a minute. But I think, Krithika, you had a question that I almost totally interrupted you on.
No. I was just going to say that go to B school to avoid Alzheimer's or dementia.
Right?
And and the other thing that came to my mind was, I was curious about, especially hearing stories from both of you in terms of, when have you actually recommended somebody to opt for the other test? So say, for example, they were going for the GMAT and you said like, hey, why don't you look at the couple of the tests or something? What's that point, a tipping point for you, preferably in terms of like couple stories or something that can help people think of pivoting to a test if needed?
Yeah. Do you want to start, Bar, or you want me to answer?
Well, I would say, we're still in this zone where things are not completely normalized between the tests. That's one thing. We had a client recently who was not scoring. They came to us after their own study. They felt like they knew the material. And I said, take a diagnostic and see how that diagnostic feels. They scored better on the GRE, but ultimately they decided they wanted to stick with the GMAT and deal with their anxiety. And that actually solved everything. So I think it just, we only pivot when we look at why are they getting things wrong on the test? Like, what's actually triggering them? Is it something fixable, or is it something that's just wonky and weird? Do we think that they're going to be better on the GRE verbal? Like, is the verbal going to be an easier verbal test for them? So it just, every client that, if that comes up, if it's not at the beginning of their study and they've already been studying, then we really want to take a careful look, because they've already invested so much time in the one test, and we don't want them to think about data sufficiency when they're doing quantitative comparison, right? Like, we don't want to have any confusion. What about you, Brett? How do you handle that?
Yeah. So the threshold would come after some strain. So I would want my student to stick with the current exam that he or she has chosen and has already been studying for, maybe taken a class for enough time that they've given it the good old college try. Because as we've been talking about, really it's all learnable. I mean, it's a very rare student, I think, that just can't eventually sort of like figure it out, have the breakthrough on data sufficiency or critical reasoning or whatever it is, with enough practice, enough coaching and support. But every once in a while, after some strain, after they've taken it 2 times, 3 times, still aren't getting the score, they've taken a course, I'd ask them the questions that Bara has hinted at. What went on test day? Like, I've had students not get a great first score because I literally had a girl, her boyfriend broke up with her like the day before her GMAT, and she, she wasn't, just wasn't mentally and emotionally there. Well, of course. So let's go back to the drawing board. It's probably give it some time, heal from the hurt, and then
we have hitmen to deal with that too, right? Don't you have a hitman squad?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So provided there's nothing abnormal going on that would suggest, what, things aren't necessarily likely to improve, then we might suggest it. And I've really only, I won't say only, but most of the time I've seen it work and be successful is moving from the GMAT to the GRE, not usually the other way around.
Agreed.
And I think we'll just call it what it is, right? We're trying to help you guys out. And I think the reasons are a couple fold. One, the high end math on the GRE tends to be a little bit easier than the high end math on the GMAT. So if you're struggling with the quant portion of things, maybe you like quantitative comparisons better. So there is that weird question type you are going to have to figure out. But even for the traditional problem solving types of questions, you can't get your level up to the really highest level for the GMAT, but the level you're at might be good enough on the GRE. And then on the verbal side, again, the reading comprehension is comparable, but you can usually figure out the vocabulary, memorize a bunch of vocabulary words. The verbal tends to be a little bit easier for students struggling with maybe the critical reasoning, for example, strengthening and weakening arguments. If you're just not having the breakthrough on the GMAT, you tend to maybe do a little bit better on the verbal side of the GRE. So I'm trying to remember if I've seen it work going the other. I've had people switch to the GMAT, but not because they couldn't get the GRE score. And oh my gosh, magically I'm now in the 90th percentile on the GMAT. That doesn't usually happen. It still might be the right move for various reasons to switch to the GMAT. But more often I've had students switch from the GMAT to the GRE with good results, and they finally get the score that'll make them competitive for the scores they're applying to.
I've had that very same experience. So let's see. What about test waivers?
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about test waivers and what your experience has been with that? Krithika, you might actually have something to say about this as well.
Wait, Krithika, were you gonna? I don't know it. She wanted you to start
about test waivers. Do you want to say a little bit about something about that?
Sure. So we do know that this was something was as a policy during the pandemic, and it kind of stuck around. And some of them do have it, but I always look at it as I would say that it could be a sword or it could be a friend, depending on how you're approaching it. Because if you're already in a very quant heavy role, then it kind of makes more sense. But however, not so. What do you think, Brett? In your experience, who has been successfully able to get those test waivers?
Yeah, so if and I would say this, fewer and fewer schools are now making these exams test optional. I think we're seeing a swing back towards schools recognizing the need and the importance and the value of these standardized tests as part of the application process when evaluating candidates. They experimented with test optional, test waivers for whatever reasons, and we don't have to rehash history here, but we're enough past the pandemic that schools recognize the value. So I think your chances of even applying to top schools, top 10 schools, top 20 schools that would allow you to apply without, those opportunities are fewer than they used to be. So it's a bit of a moot point. But I would say if you are, I'd go back to my comment earlier, don't look for the easy way out. If you can if you can, let's set this premise. It's worth, if you're applying to a school that has a test waiver option or is test optional, and you can get a competitive score anyway, it will help you, right? So let's explain the decision point. You obviously don't want to submit a crappy GMAT score or a GRE score just because I want to prove that I was willing to at least take it. No, I mean, if they're giving you an option to apply without one and you can't get a good one, roll the dice without a score and hope you bring enough to the table. So I'll grant you that. But back to what we were talking about earlier, use this as an opportunity to grow yourself, show you're serious, get a good score, because it can absolutely help your application. And I would use this analogy. I don't know exactly who our audience is, but I'm a big sports guy, so bear with me with a sports analogy. But in the NFL, professional football, they have workouts in the spring called OTAs, organizational team activities, and they're optional. But you better show up. Like, you're trying to make an NFL football team that has 54 roster spots, and they're about to pay you millions of dollars. Don't sit that one out. Like, it's optional, but it's not really optional. It's like at work. If the boss says, hey, we're staying extra to work on this project, but you can go home to your kids if you want. It's optional. You don't have to stay, but you're gunning for the corner office or you want the promotion or whatever. It's like, it's optional, but it's not really optional. And that's sort of the way I would view these test optional admissions these days is you can apply without, but they'll notice that you're applying without. And if you could get a score that will help you, why not do it? Why not spend a few $100s on a prep course, $250 to sit for the exam, get a competitive score, and get into your dream school? It's optional, but it's not really optional. That's sort of my opinion.
The way that you were talking about it before, like as it being a business school course, it's also a demonstration of business decisions that you're making, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way that you prepare for your whole candidacy in bringing on admissions consultants, in making sure your test score is as good as it can be. It's like you can say that you're going to DIY and jog in your neighborhood, or you could go to the gym, work with a trainer, keep tabs on what you're doing, right? So it is a business decision as well. And business schools will also look at, wow, they took the test a few times and they've really improved. They had perseverance and they wanted to improve, and they did. So schools are looking at that as well as character, I believe.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, one of the points I wanted to add is a lot of people waste a lot of time on the test prep without focusing on the other things. It's not like you can't do it on your own, but when you start doing it on your own, you're trying to figure out so many things, you miss out on the other important pieces, like application planning and execution and doing the research about the programs and obviously networking much before the school starts and so on. So yeah, like you want to be as efficient as possible with the test prep. And like coming to that point, like how long do you think is the time that typically candidates should be taking for any of these tests?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we're talking about sort of in the context of this conversation, applying round two. You still have time. The executive assessment was initially designed to be an exam that shouldn't take that long to prepare for. And that's part of why it's sort of that threshold exam. We talked about that earlier. You're just trying to check the box. Can I get to 150 if that's what they're expecting, for example? And you might be able to do that in a month. I mean, to give you an idea, my EA course, my complete comprehensive EA course is structured around a 4-week syllabus. Plenty of students take longer than 4 weeks, especially if you have a lot of math to brush up on. If you're trying to get more towards 155, Wharton, some of the schools want you 155 or higher. So you might not be able to just sort of do the bare minimum as we've been talking about. But I'd say for the average test taker, 4 to 6 weeks, maybe for the executive assessment, 50 to 70 hours, maybe 40 to 70 hours, something in that range of total prep time. I'd say for the GMAT and the GRE, if you're starting from scratch, a lot, 2 months, ideally, 2 to 3 months, perhaps. You can always do it faster. I mean, I have story after story I can tell you about people who've signed up my course literally a week before their exam. They cram for 4 or 5 days, score goes up. Just every little bit helps, right? So at the end of the day, every little bit helps. I mean, I always say, what are your chances of getting in without some help? So every little bit will help, even if you only have 2 days, 3 days, a week, couple of weeks. But in a perfect world, if you could devote 2 months to fully prepare from scratch, I think the averages, I have some stuff up on my blog as well in terms of average prep time for the GMAT. And again, it's the old version of the GMAT. We don't have the new numbers for the GMAT Focus Edition, but students scoring 700 or higher on average, we're spending 80 to 100 hours, some over 100 hours, but that was sort of the sweet spot for the GMAT, 80 to 100 hours. So kind of depends on your work schedule and how quickly you can chew up those 80 to 100 hours to get the 90th percentile type of a score on the GMAT. And I would say the same for the GRE, but 2 to 3 months maybe for the GMAT and the GRE, less than that, maybe a month or so for the executive assessment in a perfect world.
And conversely, if you're finding that you're spending 6 months to 2 years on this, something is not right.
Yeah.
And people come to me, and they probably come to you too, Brett, and they've spent like a year. I'm like, who told you to spend that much time?
Right.
Like, if this is a business decision, is that a good business decision?
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm constantly amazed at, well, the guy in the cubicle next to me, like, this is what he said to, it's
right.
Talk to the experts. Don't do it yourself. At least have consults. Consults are typically a free conversation to figure out what it is that you need, because you don't need to spend that much time on it, and you shouldn't. Like, it's a waste of time, and time is our most valuable resource. So I'm sure that's happened to you.
Yeah, you're spot on. Or I'll have students email me or give me a call, and they'll say, I can put in 10 hours a day. I'm like doing this full time. I'm like, you're going to be ready in a week or two then. They're like, I've got 6 months and 10 hours a day to prepare. I'm like, some of it's cultural. Some of it's like, everybody's doing this. I'm going to treat this like a full-time job. I'm going to do every single practice problem in the GMAT official guide and the supplements and this book and every question in the GMAT club online question bank. I'm going to do thousands of questions. And I'm like, remember your goal. And it goes back to what you were saying, Krithika, earlier, which is start with the end in mind. Your goal is to get the score. Let's rip that Band-Aid off. Let's get your score, move on to the rest of your life. Move on to the rest of your application, work on your essays. Don't let the GMAT dominate your life. At most 6, 7, 8 Friday nights that maybe you're not going out with your buddies because you have to study. You get up on Saturday, put in a 3-hour work, practice block on a Saturday morning, put in the work. But let's not have it dominate your life, because it doesn't need to. It's not the most important thing in the world, guys. It's important. It's part of the process, but don't spend 6 months preparing for this thing.
Yeah. So many dreams go to die at the altar of the test.
Yeah. Unnecessarily, because it's all learnable. We can coach you through it. And by the way, we can take the 100 hours average to get a 90th percentile GMAT score, cut it to 80, 60, 60, 70 with tips, tricks, strategies, mindsets, ways of getting right answers faster. You need to learn some stuff. You need to learn important stuff. You need to master the exam, but it doesn't have to dominate your life.
Brett, do you have any top tips for performing one's best on test day?
Yeah. Well, I think what you hinted at earlier, and you can absolutely talk to the inner game. So we talk about that outer game and the inner game. And I would say they're equally important, right? So for the outer game would be the X's and O's. Can you solve for X? Can you find the probability of blah, 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 blah? Do you know subject-verb agreement for sentence correction questions and things like that? So you absolutely have to study all of that stuff. Let's talk about some tips for that outer game. I would say two things. One, there are a lot of non-standard or non-traditional strategies of solving all of the different question types, right? So I talk about a success triad. Think about sort of the three component parts of doing well on these exams. You have the content you have to learn. Think of it as like a Venn diagram, right? You're going to have to learn some of that stuff when you're preparing for these exams. You have the content you have to learn to solve for X, learn subject verb agreement, whatever. You have the practice. At the end of the day, you have to practice. If you're learning to play golf, you got to go to the driving range and hit a whole bunch of balls. With feedback, by the way, that's a missing piece, right? You can't just wonder why your ball's slicing off into the woods every time on the first tee. Somebody's got to look at your swing and tell you what's wrong. So if you're not getting the score you need, get some help, but that's the practice component. So you have to learn some stuff. You absolutely have to practice it. But then strategy is that third piece of the pie. And that strategy piece matters. It's what helps you get right answers more efficiently, more accurately, avoid traps, all of that type of stuff. And especially on the quant side, Bara had talked about data sufficiency. Guys, there are ways of coming at these questions in non-traditional ways. I always tell my students, your goal is not to make your high school math teacher happy. Your goal is to get a right answer on question number 7. And if you can get a right answer on question number 7 in a non-traditional way faster, do that. Because as much as we're saying, hey, grow your brain and it's going to help you on day 1 of business school, that's all true. But if you can find the right answer to question number 7 in a minute instead of 2.5 minutes, do that. So get with somebody who can teach you some of these non-traditional strategies. The second thing I would say is remember that these are reasoning tests. On the GMAT specifically, the executive assessment is the same way. It is called the quantitative reasoning section, the verbal reasoning section, the integrated reasoning section. Data Insights doesn't have reasoning in it, but it's all reasoning based. It's not just a math test. So the mindset you come to the exam with matters in terms of how you're going to prepare and how you're looking at questions on test day, and it's going to translate to right answers. There are some questions that you can get right answers by reasoning your way to a right answer. It's not all memorizing a bunch of formulas. If it was, I could give you a cheat sheet of the 50 most important math formulas to know for the GMAT. You might have to know a couple of formulas, but mostly it's reasoning your way to right answers on the verbal side as well. And so sort of come at it with that mindset. I remember when I first started my career in test prep years ago, going on almost 20 years ago. I guess it was when I first started Dominate Test Prep in 2010. I had a Duke grad come to me wanting some help with the GMAT. And she goes, I am a Duke engineer. I graduated with an engineering degree. I've worked in engineering for a couple of years. I'm ready to go back to business school. Why can't I do GMAT math? I'm good at math. Like I'm a quant person. And I said, because GMAT math isn't Duke math. It's not engineering math. It's not a math test. There's some math you have to know, but let's look at the reasoning side of it. Let's learn data sufficiency. Let's come at questions in a slightly different way. And the light bulb sort of went on. She got a great score. And so that would be my tip sort of for the outer game type of approach to your prep. But then the inner game, guys, you can learn all the X's and O's, solving for X, all of this type of stuff. But on test day, Bara, you could probably speak to this as well. What's your anxiety level? What's your perspective if you go into the exam? And I'll just touch on this piece for a moment. Perspective matters. If you build this exam up to be life or death, if your self-worth rides on your GMAT score, we got problems because now you're putting undue pressure on yourself. No, pressure's a privilege. Pressure, a little bit of nerves, anxiety, not anxiety, a little bit of nerves, a little bit of butterflies. I'm a tennis player, right? I feel the butterflies before a big tennis match. It shows I'm ready. It shows I've treated it seriously. But the second that first serve comes my way and I'm in the point, okay, that goes away. Now I'm just in it. Now I'm just competing, right? That's what you want to have happen on test day is it matters. I want to go to business school. But Bara and I were talking about this offline before we hit record. I live in East Tennessee, right at the edge of Hurricane Helene and all the floods and all the damage and stuff like that. I was helping at a house shoveling out mud from these people's houses that was just destroyed, trying to help them get back into their home. And There's just this odor in the air, right? And these people pull up. This is maybe a little bit more serious than you guys signed up for on this call, but this is real life, right? So all of a sudden these people in a truck pulled up and they walk down the banks of the river, walk across the water to this little island and release a cadaver dog. And they ended up finding a body there. And these people whose homes, the home's just destroyed. That's like the important stuff, guys. I mean, that's life. Your GMAT score matters, but there's other stuff in life that also matters. So have some perspective. If you woke up this morning with, if you're going to eat three balanced meals today and you've got breath, air in your lungs, and the world's going to go on tomorrow, whether you get your GMAT score or not, guess what you can do? You can retake the exam. What's the worst thing that's going to happen if you don't get a 90th percentile GMAT score on your first attempt? Go back to the drawing board, figure it out, study a little bit more, take it again. Go to law school instead. There are options, there are options for you in life. The very fact that you're thinking about going to business school means you're already going to be in the top 10% of people worldwide who, are growing up eating a cup of rice for their meal for the entire day and couldn't even graduate elementary school because they're having to help in the rice fields. So I would just tell my students, have a little perspective heading into this thing and bringing it back to why that's important, not because I'm trying to give some sort of a lecture or get off on a soapbox, but because it actually translates to test day. If you take the pressure off of yourself a little bit, create a little bit of breathing room for yourself in terms of the results on test day, and all of a sudden the results on test day aren't the most important thing in the entire world, guess what actually happens? You actually perform better. You actually have clarity of thought. You aren't so stressed out that you can't think clearly, and you read the reading comprehension passage, which is the first thing you often do on verbal on the executive assessment, and you're 5 minutes into the exam and are freaking out because you have no idea what you just read and time's ticking away. Your thought process is a lot clearer, guys, if you have the right perspective on these exams.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any differently or better, right? Like, tests don't only measure what you know, they measure how well you take tests. Yeah. So it's really about making sure that you know who you are when you go in to take a test. And if you often get anxious and you read slow, then do something about it. Yeah. This isn't your first test. This isn't your first rodeo. That's all the time that we have. I want to thank you so much, Brett, of Dominate Test Prep. It was great having you today. And I want to just invite our guests, if you liked this program, to hit subscribe. We've got lots of great content coming up and schools coming up in the subsequent weeks. We've got Michigan coming, for example, and Krithika and I both graduated from there. So we're super excited about Ross joining us. And I want to just wish everyone a great week. And thanks again, Brett. And we'll see you soon.
My pleasure. Good luck, everyone.